Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We are so heartened that so many of you are interested in taking part in this very important conversation today. Um, before we get started, a few things to know. We are recording the event today, and we'll be posting a video and sharing a link in the coming days. If you'd like to submit questions or comments to the panelists during the event, you can do so on Zoom through the chat function and on YouTube Live as well. You may need to be logged in if you're joining us today on YouTube. If you want to share on social media, either during or after the event, you can tag the museum at MN Child Museum on Instagram and Twitter, and Minnesota Children's Museum on Facebook. I'm your moderator today. I'm Bob Ingracia. I'm Vice President, External Relations at Minnesota Children's Museum. And I'd like to just say a few quick words about why we're hosting this event today. We think it's incredibly relevant. Minnesota has had a tough year. In the middle of this global pandemic, we've had to cope with the police killing of George Floyd, the street protests that followed, the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police killing of Daunte Wright. The list goes on. This has been a lot for us all to process. And we want to help parents and be supportive of parents in having meaningful and important conversations with children about what's happened, what's going on in our world and what needs to change in the future. The museum wants to help drive positive change. We acknowledge that systemic racism and racial injustice are big problems in Minnesota and beyond. And we know that racial injustice harms children, harms the entire community. Children's brains are literally changed by the impact of racial injustice. And we think it's very important to talk openly and candidly with children about race, about injustice, and about building a better, more just and equitable future. So I'd like to get started. I'll briefly introduce the panelists. If you'd like to learn more about each panelist, we've got more detail on our event page at mcm.org. I'd like to start with Dr. Marianna Collins. She's Associate Professor and Director of Behavioral Medicine at Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta. She's a clinical psychologist who has spent decades working with underserved youth and families. She's an author. She co-authored Something Happened in Our Town, which is a book for children about how two families, one Black and one white, cope and process a police shooting in their town. Barb Faber is CEO of Indigenous Visioning. This is an agency that ensures that tribal voices are heard at the state and federal level. Barb is a friend of the museum. She has spent 30 years as a driving force and a leader in the White Earth Nation, working to improve childcare and early childhood education. Diane Halsey is Senior Vice President at Think Small. This is a nonprofit organization that is committed to providing resources and advocacy to improve early childhood education throughout Minnesota. And finally, Dr. Katie Lingris is Assistant Professor in the Psychiatry Department at the University of Minnesota Medical School. She's also a clinical psychologist. She specializes in early childhood mental health and social emotional development in children. And she focuses on children who experience behavioral concerns and who have suffered traumatic experiences. So I'd like to dive in. The way this will work is I'll direct a question or a general topic toward one of the panelists. The others can feel free to jump in or add to or ask their own questions. We'd like it to be a kind of a free-flowing conversation as much as possible. So let's get started. Diane, I'm going to start a question for you. Why is it important for parents and other caregivers to talk about race and racial injustice? Why is this important? I'm going to ask to unmute her. That's classic Zoom. Hold on, Diane. You're muted.
Of course.
There you go.
You hear me now? Okay.
We got you.
Thank you for inviting me to be on this illustrious panel and to talk about this very important topic. I just want to give kudos to the Children's Museum for even holding this. event. So thank you for that. So to answer your question, why is it important for parents to talk to their children about race and racism? So I have a personal dream that I'll share with you. And that is that one day our children will be able to have the kinds of conversations that we cannot seem to have here in Minnesota about race. And so it's important for us to have conversations with children about race and racism so that they know that they can have these conversations. I think that there's a misnomer that children can form racist ideas by talking about race, but actually they're already forming these ideas. In fact, as early as 6 months old, a child begins to recognize a race that is different than their caregivers. And actually by about 3 years old, we start developing implicit biases. And by about 5 or 6, those biases are already set in. And for children of color, they are already showing effects of racialized trauma as early as 7 years old, or maybe earlier. And one of the reasons why it's important is because parents are often uncomfortable talking about race to each other. So they are uncomfortable talking to their children about it. And so it's important for parents to get their children comfortable talking about these, because if they don't talk about it, all that children are left with is to learn from the implicit biases of their caregivers and their environment without the context. It's important to validate children's experiences that they may be having about race. And I think also because parents are uncomfortable about it, they oftentimes think that they have to have all the right answers and they have to know everything perfectly. And that is not true either. The important thing is just to be able to open the conversation so that children know that they can talk about race. It is not a taboo subject. And that they can ask questions. They can come back later and ask questions of their caregivers.
Great. And I'm just going to make this point explicit. And Barb, just to follow up, and Diane, thank you for that, because I think you made a good point, and I want to just follow up with Barb, just to make it explicit, because I've heard some parents say it's racist to talk about race. And Barb, what would you say if you heard a neighbor or a colleague or a friend say, "Oh, we don't talk about race because that's racist"?
Well, being an early childhood advocate all my life, I would say that we need to talk about race and celebrate diversity. Instead of just talking about being a racist, we got to celebrate diversity. I think that's on a level that children can comprehend. And racism, just like other diseases, it's 100% preventable. But we need to start early. And we need, while we can't erase the historical trauma and the effects of historical trauma on generations, we can start by helping children embrace diversity and embrace differences and being intentional, like having those conversations with children. And like Diane just said, from a young age, they can tell that difference. And research tells us that the chronic stress leads to actual changes in hormones that cause inflammation in a body, marker for chronic disease. And I'm sure the experts on the panel will talk more about that. But we do need to have those conversations with children, and we need to expose our children to as much diversity that we can by, having conversations, watching movies, reading books to children that celebrates diversity, and for children to see people of color as heroes and not just victims of oppression.
Right.
We need to encourage parents and caregivers to be intentional in those conversations.
Great.
Um,
Thank you for that, Barb.
thank
Right.
you.
I'm going to ask a question to Marietta. So I think sometimes a number of parents or caregivers are tempted to respond to a child that initiates a conversation about race or makes an observation about race, that all people are the same, or we don't see color. I'm wondering, like, is that something that you encounter, and is that an effective approach or not an effective approach?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. And I certainly do applaud the comments that both Diane and Barb have made thus far. And it leads, right into some of the issues that we talk about. And something happened in our town. It's certainly, some parents will find it uncomfortable to talk about race with their children. And some parents may think that, well, as long as I'm not overtly discriminating or saying negative things, about people who are of a different race than I am, then I'm giving my child a message that's a good message. And that is that, everybody's the same. All people are the same. I'm treating everybody equally. But what that really does is that really dismisses the rich diversity within all peoples. So we really consider the everybody's all the same. Don't say anything. If a child says, "Oh, we're in the grocery store," a child sees a man who is Black, African American, child, may innocently say, "Mom, why is that man so dirty? Why didn't he take a bath?" And you as a mom might be mortified and say, "Shh, don't say that. That's not nice." Which is certainly a colorblind approach to parenting. When we espouse instead is what we call race conscious parenting, where in fact diversity is celebrated, it's openly discussed, okay, and the door remains open for continued discussion about differences. In that same scenario, when a child might say, "Mom, why is that man dirty?" Certainly you would correct him and say, "No, he's not dirty. That is the color of his skin is brown, or depending upon what he looks like, because he's of a different race." People who are dark brown because their ancestors came here from a country in Africa where everybody looks like them, okay, in terms of the skin color. So just being open to differences, calling differences, out, just talking about them openly with your children in an ongoing manner is a lot more effective than not discussing race at all and having your children think that it is taboo. Because even if in fact you don't talk about race, as I think Barb and Diane said, children become aware of race very early on. And we as parents or caregivers, we are the models that children look to in terms of race and racial relationships. So even if we were to espouse, let's say, a colorblind versus a race conscious parenting approach, if they look at us and see that we're surrounding ourselves with people who look just like us, that if they don't see us having cross-racial friendships, they don't see our homes reflecting diversity, either in the artwork, in the dolls your little kids might play with, in the, I guess I'll say, even in the extracurricular sports activities you involve your children in, then they're getting a message that, that's not quite right. I should stick with my race. I feel more comfortable here. So it's important, I think, very early on to have open conversations with children about race, and to really espouse a race conscious parenting approach.
Great, thank you for that. We had a question come in through the chat that I want to direct toward Katie, having to do with age. When is it appropriate? What age? And we'll explore this a little further, because I think this is important, and a lot of parents are wondering about types of conversations by age. A toddler, a 3-4-year-old, and then when children get older. So what age is appropriate to start these kind of conversations?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bob, and thanks as well for convening this panel. I agree, it's a very important topic, and I'm so glad we're all getting to chat together today. I think one thing you've heard from all of us so far is that kids are noticing race and noticing even racism from really early ages. And so kids are noticing difference even as early as infancy. And so there really is no point which kids are too young, right? When they're never too young to start talking about race, just like they're never too young to start describing the world around them and the cars that are passing by and the grass that's turning green outside. Kids are noticing things in the world. And as we've heard, kids are noticing differences in skin color, differences in hair, differences in the way that people look. And so one of the ways that we can help normalize and celebrate difference is to talk about that even with infants, right? And as you've heard, as Marianna shared that example in the grocery store, you've likely heard kids and been with kids who pointed out difference, and there are no shortage of questions that kids have to ask. And so when they're starting to ask these questions and notice these things, it's our job as adults to let them know these are okay things to talk about, right? And again, we can start doing that from as early as infancy. And the biggest thing that we want to really be thinking about too is being proactive, right? We've heard from a few of my colleagues here that this idea of kids are picking up stereotypes and biases really early on. And so if we wait to talk about it even until preschool or later than that, then kids are getting information from the world around them. They're getting information about the biases, about our society and the systemic racism that exists in it. And so they may actually be getting ideas that we don't necessarily agree with. We wouldn't teach them, but they're taking those ideas in already. And so if we're being proactive, we're really starting from those infancy, early ages of talking about these things. By the time they start to notice and pick up on these biases, even just a year or two later, they've already got some messages coming from them. And we can use things like toys and books and things in our environment to start these conversations. One of the things that I think about in terms of how we start these conversations and what we talk about, and you were starting to allude to how do we do this at different ages, is this idea of taking bites of an apple. And this is an analogy that comes from Beverly Daniel Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? If you ever have been around a young child who has asked for an apple, chances are you've seen them take a bite, put it back down on the counter, walk away, go play for a little bit, come back, take another bite, then walk away and play for a little bit. And maybe over the course of an afternoon, they've eaten part of an apple, maybe the whole apple, but they're coming back when they're ready. They're coming back to take that next bite. And so when we think about starting these conversations, if we've opened the door, we can give those bites of the apples and they're going to come back. We're going to let them know it's okay to keep talking about this, and they'll have an experience and come back and ask us about it and know that it's okay to talk about. And we can kind of adjust our language based on those ages and those experiences.
Great. And just kind of a follow-up really to the group. I mean, curious, like what it sounds like. Let's talk a little bit about maybe a 3 or 4-year-old who's really noticing.
Can I follow up to that?
Yes, absolutely.
Bob?
Yes. Yep.
So I just want to really follow up on what both Katie and Dr. Collins said. So true. Young children are like sponges, so they're really picking up everything around them, and they categorize things to kind of help them make sense of their world. And so they're not born racist, but they are born very curious. And so when they point out things like a different color, they're trying to categorize. We're the ones that attach some kind of racist meaning behind it, but they're just trying to categorize, like in the example that Dr. Collins gave in the grocery store. That young child is just trying to categorize what they're seeing because they've never seen it before. So being able to talk to your young children about the fact that there are different races, there are different colors, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's all good, it's just different, is important. Being able to say, it's just like they might, point out the fact that, the grass is green and the flowers are red. Yes, that's true. And so you'll say, yes, that person has brown skin, or yes, that person's hair is a little darker, a little coarser, but do it in a way that you're celebrating the fact that it's great and it's different. It may be different, but it's great. Just like you are great. And it's important to to do that in a way and to say it in a way that is not scary or, ominous, because they pick up on all of that too. They pick up on those things. And so the other thing I wanted to say about that too, it's not always just even what you say, it's how you behave. So if you go into, for instance, if a white person goes into a room full of Black people and they unconsciously are very tense, their body tenses up, then that child that you're with will learn to tense their body up when they walk into a room full of African Americans. And the opposite is true too. If you don't tense up, if you're very relaxed, the same as you always are everywhere else, then that child will learn to be relaxed the same as they are everywhere else. And so those are some other things for you to be aware of in your body when you are around, especially for white people, if they are around children of color or people of color, to notice those things and be cognizant of that also when you're with your children.
Great, thank you for adding that. We're getting a number of questions through chat to kind of push it a little further, because first part of our conversation really here is about young children noticing and just talking about race as differences, and noticing and acknowledging and celebrating differences. With older kids then, we're getting questions about like, okay, what about these very difficult incidents? What about racial injustice? What about police shooting a Black person? And now we're talking about that. It's on the news, and kids are talking about it in the street. So Marianna, I mean, you co-authored a book about this, and I know it'll be a different answer for Black family, Black parents and white parents and other parents of color. So what does it sound like to talk to a maybe 7 or 8 year old about these very difficult topics?
Thank you for that question. And I've been noticing, the questions in the Q&A and chat, and these are all just excellent questions. And I really appreciate how engaged the audience is. And the way our book starts, is that something bad happened in our town. The parents didn't think the kids knew, but the kids knew. And that's pretty much the way it is. That parents may think, oh, he doesn't know about the police shooting. He doesn't know about this or that, but kids hear about things. They hear it in my book, from their older siblings and from the adults just talking about it. And what happens is that, there's a little white girl, there's a little Black boy. They each go to their respective homes and they ask questions, they ask questions about the police. I saw a couple of questions in the chat about the police. Why did the police shoot that man? Was that man bad? Was it those kinds of things. So being open to talking about the history of racism in our country is really important. And our book provides a guide for how to do that in age-appropriate language. Within the little white girl's family, that family talks about the fact that they owned slaves, and that slaves were people that had to do everything that somebody said. They didn't have a choice, and that was wrong to do. In the Black family talks about the fact that, yes, they were part of people who were enslaved against their will. And that, but despite that, we have many leaders who have been able to overcome that. We advocated, we marched, we protested so that we could have civil rights. So again, what this book does is to really provide some very child-friendly language for parents and in terms of how to talk to children about this difficult subject. We have a note in the back of the book that has role plays with definitions for racism, discrimination, prejudice. How can you integrate this into a classroom setting if that's what you want to do? But I can't remember which of these well-spoken women said it, but you don't feel that you have to have all the right answers at that moment. Because again, just as Katie said, the child's going to come back again and want another bite of that apple. So you can say, oh, I thought about it, and the answer I gave, it might not have been so clear. Let me say something else about it. What you're doing is you're modeling that you're open to talking about it. And that just because you've had the conversation one time doesn't mean that the door is closed. Oh no, the door remains open.
Right. Barb, I want to just build on that. And language around, Marietta talked about language around slavery, right? Very difficult, painful, all sorts of with that. What about with Native nations, and what might that conversation sound like regarding the difficult history in America around Native Americans?
Well, I would say that I would agree with what Marietta said. Is we need to talk about that. We need to have those conversations with children, and if we want them to understand what racism is, they also need to understand, age appropriate, of course, what that historical trauma is. In order to understand those feelings that you don't even know you have, even as adults, we need to understand it before where we've been to know where we're going. And so those conversations are going to help that. But at the same time, you also want to open the conversation and ask the child what they're thinking. What do they think about what could help us as a society to celebrate more diversity? Or what is the child thinking when they're asking us these questions, and what are they thinking about the future? I think it's important to have those conversations, but also ask them about the future, to prompt those questions.
Great. Thank you for that. We're getting some really great questions in from the audience, and wanting to follow up on some of them. I'm looking at some of the lists here. One question we had, again, in this, and beyond the noticing and the recognition of race, a question that came in: should parents be thinking about preparing kids ahead of time for the potential of mean comments? For example, against Asian Americans, or against Black children, any child of color, really any bias type things that they may encounter at school or elsewhere. Do you prepare kids in advance for this, or just kind of maybe navigate that only when it occurs? And I'll have maybe have Katie jump in on that one.
Sure. Yeah, I think I think sort of one of the things that is kind of inherent to this question is, do we have to talk about this stuff, right? Especially things like preparing kids for bias or police violence or civil unrest. And I think it's really important to be thinking about who it is that has to prepare their children for these kinds of experiences. And the idea that if you are choosing not to talk about it, that inherently is a privilege, right? Because not all families are afforded the opportunity to be able to say, oh, this isn't really directly affecting us, or this is happening 15 miles away. We don't really have to talk with our kids about that. And so, I encourage you all to think too, if that is something that you've thought, or you've been in that situation, what does it mean for you if, let's say, your second grader isn't directly affected, quote unquote, but their classmates are hearing conversations and having conversations within their families about this idea of preparation for bias, what's going to be coming up for them? What does it mean that those classmates know what's going on, have this experience, and your child doesn't? I think one of the things we've been alluding to is a lot of adults now are having to undo learning or lack of learning that we either did or didn't experience in our childhoods. And so kind of imagining what it might be like for kids to grow up having these conversations could result in really different experiences throughout childhood, but also as adults when they go to parents. So I think, in terms of kind of preparing for these conversations, I'll let Diane speak a little bit more to kind of the differences in what these conversations might look like. But I think that one of the things that we really want to think about is doing our own work first, right? So processing our own emotions, whether you are a parent or a caregiver of color or a white caregiver a white caregiver, what is your experience? What are your emotions? What are your biases? Kind of doing our own work first so that we can approach these conversations calmly with kids, and we can send those messages that it's okay to talk about, this isn't something scary. Really trying to start with what kids know, and then giving those bites of the apple, giving really clear, concrete language, keeping things simple. Even things like talking about police violence can be made developmentally appropriate and concrete, right? Marianna's book is a great example of that. We can use kids' books. We can use really just simple language. You know, police killed a Black man and people are really angry about it. They went out into the streets to say that they're angry. That covers a whole bunch of topics that have a lot of adult layers, but for kids as a starting point, we can just have those simple sentences. And we want to make sure that we're being real. So talking about what is going on, but also making sure that we're not sharing information in a really scary way or a potentially traumatizing way. So we want for young kids certainly to not be seeing, or for many age kids and many adults, not to be seeing traumatizing images, not to necessarily be watching the videos that are shared, but talking about, you know, what's going on and explaining to them in, again, most developmentally appropriate kind of details.
I'd also like to kind of address, I'm sorry, Diane,
No, go
you'd
ahead.
like to go ahead? Okay, I also like to address what you had asked, Bob, in terms of how do you prepare kids to go out into the world? And that reminds me of another aspect of race-conscious parenting, which is to prepare children for bias, which is out in the world, while also intentionally developing high self-esteem. So that's certainly really important to do within your home, because within your home, you can create an environment that is very supportive and loving and reinforcing for your child. You know, but if you are a person of color, when you leave that home, they will face a world that's not always so nice. That's not going to always be so supportive. So having talks about the historical, what happened in our history to create the kind of divisiveness that's out there, helping children to understand that, yes, this is a part of the history of America. These are the things that have happened to change this history. You know, but certainly talking about it early on, getting your child prepared, you know, that this is a part of your history. You know, this is what we believe, you know, as a people. This is what we believe about ourselves. You are just as smart. You are just as attractive. You're just as, I mean, very direct language. You may not hear from the outside that those things are true, but we know that they are true. So again, having these conversations very early on and repeatedly with your children before, you know, they are faced with going out into a racist world.
I just want to really follow up on what Dr. Collins said. That is so key. And for children of color, for those of us raising children of color, the self-esteem part, what I like to call ego strength, is really important, because that child is going to have to know who they are, because the world will see them differently.
Yes.
And there will be a point in time, not an if, but a when they are going to have to stand up and tell the world who they are, which is different from how they're being perceived. If they don't have that ego strength or that self-esteem, what happens is they internalize that racism and they begin to believe those negative messages that are told about them. And I'm going to tell a quick story that kind of illustrates this. So we have 3 boys, and when our children were young, we did a lot. We sent them to a preschool that was an African-American cultural preschool, and which, was great, and they learned a lot. But then, they went to public school, and our public school is diverse, but most of the teaching staff are white. And so when my youngest son moved from 6th grade to 7th grade in our district, 6th grade was still in the elementary, so 7th was the junior high, was a big deal, and so the first day I took off work a little early. I came home because I wanted to know how my son's first day of junior high went. And first thing, he walked in the door and I was like, "How did it go?" First thing he said, "My homeroom teacher is racist." And I said, "Okay, hold on a minute. Let's sit down and let's tell me what happened." So what happened is he walked into his homeroom class, and the first thing, and my son was very bright, I think he had some colorful clothes on, whatever. The teacher said, "What's up, Flavor Flav?" Now, for those of you who don't know who Flavor Flav is, he is an African-American man who is a known drug addict, and I can best describe him as a buffoon. And this is who he was referring my son to. And what my son did, which I was so proud of him, was that he said, oh no, my name is Winton. Now, see, what happened in those very few seconds is that that teacher was trying to tell him who he was, which was not a pleasant description, but he knew who he was, so he had to correct him. Those kinds of incidents happen all the time to children of color at all different ages. And our children need to know who they are, because they're going to have to unfortunately, they will have to tell somebody that their perception of them is not correct. But when that doesn't happen, when they're not able to do that, then those images that people have, they just continue and they just perpetuate. So that's how important it is to really be able to have those conversations with children when they're young.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. That was very important to hear. I wanted to build on that again. Talking about the external world, maybe telling people who they are when that's not truly who they are, and obviously a lot of that can come from the police, right, in our community. So, and how policing and law enforcement treats people differently, because we are getting a lot of questions. I want to see what different panelists might say. A number of questions about speaking to children about police. And a couple of questions saying, you know, a year ago, I normally would have just said, oh, the police, they're here to help us and they're heroes, or that kind of thing around the police. And now, right, there's different messages coming at children and maybe questions being asked. Are all police bad? Can somebody jump in and talk about what a conversation might sound like with a 4 or 5, 6-year-old about, you know, what parents might, how we might address police specifically? We're getting a number of questions about that. Like, how do I talk about the cops?
So one of the parts in our book that has been somewhat controversial is the whole issue of the police shooting. And one of the characters in the book says that, would police shoot me? Yeah, police would shoot me just because I'm Black. And I think the father might say that. And just trying, so we've received lots of, I guess I say, negative comments. Our book has been banned in some states from being in specific school systems. What we try to do in our book is really to provide a more nuanced view of police officers. What the parents say is that not all policemen are bad. You know, that in fact, mom's girlfriend, Keisha, she's a police officer. Not all, they're Black police officers and white police officers. Sometimes they make good choices, but then sometimes they make mistakes. And as Black people, we can't always count on them to treat us fairly. You know, so we have to be aware of the fact that people do look at us, you know, as Black people, okay? And again, given the historical information we've already talked about in the book, you know, we do talk about, you know, the, I guess I'll say the positive and the negative sides, you know, that police officers have shown to Black people. Within the back section of the book, you know, there is certainly dialogue and lots of information that talks about the fact that, you know, most policemen never even shoot their guns. You know, they try to solve problems non-violently. You know, there is a move to have more community policing so that children can get to know police officers, you know, on a kind of a one-on-one, more informal basis. One of the things that's really striking is when we first started to promote our book, and my co-authors are white, lots of people are really struck with the fact that Black people have that talk, you know, with their kids, you know, very early on about police officers. We can remember, you know, parents in the audience who were white saying, well, I didn't know that. I did not know that happened, that had to happen. It was really an eye opener. So, so certainly it's really important to, you know, to talk, you know, openly about police officers, you know, and be able to have those ongoing conversations.
Anybody else want to tackle that one?
I think this is a great example too of thinking about, what kind of nuance you add as kids get older. So, and as well, kind of knowing history and knowing the history of our country. So knowing that policing started out in the times of slavery and, kind of the roots of policing can help, especially older kids who might have learned some of this history or may not have, to contextualize, why might there be biases in how policing works? Why might there be different experiences? And with young children, you may not get into all of those different layers in the same way, but many preschools and infant toddler classrooms do units on community helpers. And so that can be a time where you start to talk about, what has your experience been like? There might be people who have different experiences with different types of community helpers. And again, starting to normalize, not that exists, it shouldn't be normal, but that people have different experiences based on their identities. And that can be part of the conversation even from those early years.
Yeah, I will add that that children are already, if you don't have the conversation with them about police, they are already picking things up and they're already forming their opinions about police. There's a colleague of mine who runs a child care program at the University of Minnesota, and one of the child had a medical situation. So an ambulance came, and with the ambulance, the police showed up. And one of the children looked at the police and asked her, "Is that one of the good police or one of the bad police?" So they're already forming ideas about police already, just because that's a conversation that's in our environment right now. And I think it is important to say what the situation is, developmentally appropriate. It's okay to say that there are some bad people in the world, and some of those bad people might just happen to be police officers. That is not the majority of them. But then to talk about, this is what it might look like, very simply, this is what, it might look like, because they're already forming these opinions.
And I would like to add on to that is just to reaffirm that having children understand what stereotyping is. I mean, so the media has has helped stereotype police officers. So, I think the more children that can understand the term of stereotyping, I think that's going to also help with those conversations. That just what Diane just said, not all police are bad, and they are heroes. So
Yeah, Barb, you brought up media stuff, and I wanted to ask about when we encounter as parents stereotype and obvious bias, or maybe not even subtle bias in books, cartoons, shows, lots of classic media that we encounter that kids will see. Is there how might a parent respond when we're watching like a movie and we see something that's maybe cringeworthy or that kind of thing? What's a good way? Should we call it out and use that as an opportunity to talk about the concept of stereotyping? I don't know. I'm wondering, Barb, what you might say if you're, to a young child when you see a totally like inappropriate portrayal of Native Americans, let's say in a cartoon, which that happened. I can think of a number of examples in pop culture about that. And so how might you address that with a child?
well, if I don't address it, that's a missed opportunity for me to talk about stereotyping and what that means. And that's a conversation, a perfect opportunity to talk about differences and the word stereotyping.
Yeah,
I'll turn it over to Kate or
I
Dr.
would certainly
Collins.
agree. I would, as you said, Bob, do you call it out? I would say, I would just talk about what just happened. Said, did you notice X, Y, and Z? What do you think about that? Okay. How do you think that person felt when he heard someone say X, Y, and Z about that? Do you think what would you say in a situation like that? How could you be a person that stands up for change and not just be a bystander and let those negative things happen? So certainly, doing that kind of thing, and again, using age appropriate language, I think is important.
I think, the other thing, Bob, to go back to one of the examples you gave, is this idea of the stereotypes when we run into them in media and, movies and things like that. They're not always egregious, right? They're not always obvious things that we have to call out that we can clearly see. And so I think part of that goes back to, the more that we do our own work, the harder it is to unsee those kinds of things when they happen. And so, you can be watching a movie prior to doing some of that work and not notice things, and then starting to notice those things, and gives you those opportunities to start talking with kids about them. And one of my personal examples about this is, think about most Disney movies that you've seen, or most kids movies where there's a villain, and odds are the villain has some sort of accent, some sort of like foreign sounding accent, or has other sort of attributes that we would think about that are likely to be associated with folks of color. And so how many movies have we watched and not even thought about that? But as you start to think about that and see that, you notice kids are getting these messages implicitly without even having it be something very obvious. And so those implicit things are really important to call out and start conversations about as well.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, because you're right. Once you're made aware, then you're going to start noticing that kind of thing so much more often. I'm going to see if I can surface another question. Oh, this is a tough one. I mean, we're talking about parents and caregivers, but we've got a number of teachers who've joined our event today, and prompting some questions about how teachers might address this in a classroom, which raises different kind of questions. It could be multiracial. That's possibly a bigger topic for another day, but I'm just wondering if there's any advice for teachers to spur a conversation in a broader group like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll say a couple of things about that. One of them is, first of all, there's absolutely a lot that teachers can do in their classroom to create an environment that is open for conversation about race, that doesn't make it a heavy thing, especially when children are young. Like I said, it's good to celebrate children's differences and their cultures. There's a lot that you can do to do that, and to really celebrate, and have all kind of books and toys and resources in the classroom that are multicultural. And that's important if your classroom is multicultural. But I'll also want to say it's also important if all your children are white in the classroom. And we get that question a lot of times. People think if all of their children are white in the classroom, maybe I don't have to talk about this diversity thing. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because this is, once again, especially when children are young, if you have a preschool classroom, that is the age where we really want to be talking about these things and getting children comfortable talking about race and knowing how to celebrate race, because that's the age that their biases are starting to set in. So if you're having these conversations and helping to frame them around their eyes and their mind to be able to celebrate this culture. And the fact of the matter is, our world, our country is becoming increasingly more diverse. And so you're also preparing your children to be able to live in the multicultural society, that we have now.
Yeah, here's a question that came in too. About, it gets at what you're talking about, I think, with like an all-white classroom. So the question is, can you give an example of how white parents can prepare or talk with their children about speaking out in support of people of color and other children of color when they're encountering an injustice? They'll notice and they'll see an injustice. If you've been starting to have these conversations at home or whatever, and then now they start to see it out in the world, just like Katie was talking about, you made aware, you start to see it. And then preparing children I guess, to be an ally ultimately. And Marianna, I know it happens in the book, in your book, that's the closing kind of anecdote there in the book. So I guess the question there is, the question from our audience was, should parents prepare and encourage, I guess, their children to, white parents to have their children stick up for or call out an injustice and express that they're not going to tolerate it on the playground or wherever.
Yes, certainly in our book, what happens is there's a child of, I guess I would say, Eastern Indian descent who joins the classroom, because it's a classroom that has Black kids and white kids, and a new kid joins. And he's of Eastern Indian descent, doesn't speak English very well, very shy. And when the kids go outside to play soccer, everybody gets chosen for a team except that one little boy's name is Omar. And so the Black and the white kid remember what they learned from home about how you should stand up and how it's not right to treat people who are different unfairly. And so they stick up for him and say, he is playing, he's going to be on my team. So certainly, you can give your child that message very early on, that they have power, that they can start to enforce change. I did also want to mention 2 books related to parents, that parents, especially white parents, might find to be very interesting. I shared this already earlier, so it should be on your resource list. But there are 2 books. One is called Raising White Children by Jennifer Harvey, which is it's excellent, and also How to Raise an Anti-Racist Child by Rebecca Janop. So those are 2 great resources that we found to be very helpful in this journey that we've been on with our book.
Yeah, and I noticed in the book, and that anecdote, when the girl steps up and says, he's playing,
Yes.
and then she says, we don't want to miss out.
Right.
She doesn't say we don't want him to miss out, which I just thought was a very interesting way to put that. And I wondered if you could talk about the point and whether that was purposeful and what you mean by the white girl saying, I don't want to miss out by having him not play.
That's great. And thanks for picking up on that. Well, the message we were trying to get, and we said it a little bit earlier in the book, is that you never know who's going to be your best friend, who might be your best friend. If you just discriminate against somebody, don't even give them a chance, you might be missing out. So she's like, hey, we don't want to miss out. This could be my best friend. I need an opportunity to get to know him. So yes, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that grows into a bigger point around the entire society missing out. That's where we're trying to get to, right? All of the potential and the inventions and the artwork and all of that will get made by people of color. If they're thwarted or discriminated against, everyone loses out. We lose out what they would have brought. So I know we've still got a few minutes here, and we've still got some great questions coming in. Here's a white parent wrote a question to us. How do I expose my child to diversity in an authentic way? She says, we have lots of books, diverse books and toys, but she's talking about in person. She said, our neighborhood is all white kids, and it seems wrong to just start signing them up for dance, soccer, et cetera, in different neighborhoods, and to go to other neighborhoods just for that. She says, I don't want their new friends to feel like their token Black friend, or their family think we're hanging out with them just because they are Black. Yeah. So I don't know who wants to tackle that one, but I mean, that's a thing that parents in not very diverse suburbs, let's say of Minneapolis or St. Paul, having that feeling, wanting to, right? Just wondering what you might say to them.
One thing I will say, and then I'll open it up for the rest of the panelists, is that children take a lot, they're looking at you. So if you have a diverse network of friends and people that you socialize with, if you have Black and brown friends that you have lunch with or come over to the house or play cards with, that's going to show them. And so I don't know if you're just wanting them to have a diverse set of friends without you having a diverse set of friends and relationships, it does seem a little inauthentic. but they're going to get more from you, from watching you have your diverse network of friends and relationships as a model to them.
Mhm.
One thing too
We've
that's
got-
inherent in that
Oh, you want to jump in on that one, Katie?
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think one thing inherent to that question is, being able to show up authentically, right? So doing some of this work, thinking about these issues, having some of these conversations before you start to put yourself in a space that is different from your own family's, culture, skin color, whatever it is, so that you're genuine in wanting to learn more, but that you're not sort of showing up expecting to be taught or expecting to be having others do a lot of emotional labor. And, I think in that example too, the idea of resources is really important. So, are you going to a community event that's open for everybody, or are you going to another community and taking a slot in a soccer team that could be somebody, a slot that a child from that neighborhood could be using, and sort of being intentional about what kinds of opportunities you take advantage of, particularly if you are someone who is white or more privileged, that you're kind of being mindful of that.
Well, we're getting down to the last couple of minutes. I wanted to see, to hear from whoever wants to answer, just kind of final sort of words of encouragement or support for parents going forward. Starting now. Like what kind of words, what kind of support can you offer?
I'd like to respond to that. I think, just throughout the conversations we had today is about being intentional and knowing that racism is 100% preventable. And so if children are starting out, in the early years of learning about diversity, they're going to be in a better place, and they're going to, lead by example. And I know, in the indigenous communities, we try to teach and utilize the teachings of the Southern grandfathers of respect, respecting elders, and for everything we've learned, love, to show love to those around us, truth, to be truthful to ourselves and others, for bravery and courage. It's important to face our fears and be courageous for yourself or for others. Wisdom, to learn from the past and use that knowledge in our lives. Very wise to think before you speak and plan before you act. Generosity, to have a giving heart, shows much respect and love. Give someone support selfishly. And humility, to be humble, to know your self-worth and recognize that we can always learn more and do better. It's accepting our part in life and creating how we show that acceptance and worth to others. So we need to nurture children's natural humanity and kindness to prevent racism now and in the future.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
Well, anybody else want to try to follow up that awesome list? That's very
Really,
inspirational.
I would agree. What I would just say is that, the main point of what I've tried to say today, what's in our book, is how important it is for parents to have these conversations with their children. In order for our society to change, we have to be committed to starting to have such conversations very early on in the lives of our children. We have to lead by example. We have to show them that we are willing to take that scab off the Band-Aid and look at it, that we're willing to really talk about the history of racism in our country, the history of civil rights in our country, how we've overcome, why is it that, some neighborhoods don't have the same kinds of resources as other neighborhoods? We just have to really start again to openly have difficult conversations and not underestimate, the sensitivity, and observational skills of our kids. In order for there to be change, we have to be committed to starting to make these changes at home ourselves and not wait until they go to school and say it's the responsibility of the school system, it's the responsibility of that person. No, it's your responsibility as a parent of these children. And you want to be the parent that really instills the morals and values that are important to you and your family in your children's lives.
Right. Well, I'm gonna jump in because we're hitting right at 1. Just for the participants, we're going to follow up. We have a tip sheet that consolidates some of what you heard today, a resource list. We'll have a link to the recording and a survey about this event. So that'll all be coming to the emails of people who registered for the event. I want to thank everybody for participating. I also want to thank the University of Minnesota, which was kind enough to give the Minnesota Children's Museum access to the Zoom platform, so we could have so many people join. So thanks everyone. If Diana, Katie, if you have those final words, I wanted to get that in. If you have the final word, the kind of the last sort of message of support for parents, go for it.
Just quickly, I'll just say that these conversations, they don't have to be perfect. And that and sometimes you may not have the answer. It's okay to say, I don't know, but it's just important to have the conversation so that children can know that they can talk about these things. And I'll just do a quick plug for my podcast where we talk about these issues. We talk about how do parents talk to young children about race? It's called Early Risers, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts.
Great, thank you.
Well, I think it's a great sign that my final word was going to be right along the same lines, just that there's no one shot, there's no one opportunity. You know, these conversations today, our group conversation is definitely not the end. It's hopefully the beginning or the continuation of learning and conversations. And so definitely, you know, continue these conversations in your homes, in your classrooms with your children, whatever spheres you overlap with children and with other adults as well. And know that you can keep coming back once that door is open and continue those conversations.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I was just so grateful for your time and your expertise. It's been very helpful. We're getting really great comments coming in saying, thanking us, thanking all of you for your time and all the great conversation and information that we talked about today. So I'm going to sign off. Thank you, everybody. And we'll be in touch via email with the resource list and the tip sheet and the survey link. So thank you very much. And this is obviously not the end of the conversation, but we're so glad we were able to host this today. So thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.